The first soul-chilling indicator that Arthur Miller's meticulously ordered world had been violently upended was the silence. Not a peaceful quiet, but a gaping, unnatural void where the familiar cheerful chitters and soft clicks of Nico, his highly trained Capuchin support monkey, should have been. Arthur, 82 years old, and rendered a quadriplegic by a catastrophic stroke a decade prior, relied on Nico for nearly every aspect of his daily life. Nico was his hands, his fetcher of dropped remotes and sippy cups, his page-turner, his alert system, his constant, intelligent, and deeply beloved companion. The little primate, with his bright, inquisitive eyes and astonishingly nimble fingers, was more than an aide. He was Arthur's lifeline to independence and dignity within the four walls of his home in the Golden Pines Estates. This Saturday morning, however, Nico's usual playful morning greeting, a soft tug on Arthur's pajama sleeve, followed by a shared piece of banana, was absent. Arthur had woken to an unnerving stillness, a profound sense of wrongness. His specialized voice-activated environmental controls, which Nico often supplemented by physically pressing buttons Arthur couldn't reach, were unresponsive to his increasingly frantic calls for his live-in caregiver Maria, who was scheduled to arrive shortly. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at him. Nico was always there, perched on the back of his wheelchair by sunrise, ready to start their day. When Maria finally arrived, her usual cheerful greeting died on her lips as she took in Arthur's evident distress and the conspicuous absence of the little Capuchin. A quick, frantic search of the small, meticulously organized house yielded nothing. Nico's elaborate, enriching enclosure in the sunroom was empty, the latch on its access door, one only Nico or a human could operate, disturbingly ajar. On the sunroom floor, near the slightly open back door that led to Arthur's small fenced patio, lay Nico's favorite puzzle toy, a bright blue ball with hidden treat compartments looking forlorn and abandoned. There were no signs of forced entry, no obvious struggle, just absence. Nico, who was trained never to leave Arthur's side without a direct command, or in case of an emergency to fetch help, had vanished. It was then that Maria, her face pale with alarm, noticed their next-door neighbor and HOA president Karen Bishop vigorously, almost obsessively, hosing down her own patio, a task usually reserved for her hired gardening service. Karen, a woman whose disapproval of Nico had been a thinly veiled but constant undercurrent in their otherwise peaceful neighborhood, didn't look up, didn't acknowledge Maria's increasingly worried calls over the fence. She just kept spraying as if trying to wash away something unseen. The call to Arthur's daughter, Special Agent Zara Khan, chief of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Exotic Animal Enforcement Division, was made with trembling hands by Maria. Zara, who was 2 states away wrapping up a complex undercover operation involving the trafficking of endangered reptiles, felt a premonitory chill as she listened to Maria's fractured, panicked account. Her father, his vulnerability, his absolute dependence on Nico, and Karen Bishop's long-standing, barely concealed animosity towards the highly regulated, legally permitted support primate. Maria listened to me very carefully, Zara said, her voice already shifting into the calm, authoritative tone that commanded teams of armed federal agents in dangerous high-stakes raids. Lock all the doors. Do not let anyone into the house. Do not confront Mrs. Bishop. I am on my way. I'll have a local law enforcement unit there in minutes for a welfare check and to secure the area. Tell Dad I'm coming, and we will find Nico. We will bring him home. As Zara boarded an emergency flight, her mind a finely tuned instrument for dissecting complex criminal enterprises involving exotic animals, was already piecing together a horrifying but chillingly plausible scenario. Karen Bishop had a history of petty complaints about Nico, his unnatural presence, the potential danger he posed, despite Nico's impeccable training and gentle demeanor, the unpleasant noises he made, the soft chitters that were in fact a comfort to Arthur. Zara had on several occasions, professionally and politely, provided Karen with copies of Arthur's federal and state permits, for Nico the extensive documentation from the accredited organization that had trained him and detailed information on the laws protecting legitimate service and support animals. Karen had always responded with a dismissive sniff, muttering about loopholes and people thinking they're above community standards. Had Karen's prejudice finally escalated from passive aggression to active criminal interference? Had she somehow lured or taken Nico? The thought of the small, intelligent primate who required a specialized diet, constant mental stimulation, and the familiar comfort of Arthur's presence in the hands of someone like Karen Bishop, someone ignorant of his needs and hostile to his very existence, filled Zara with a cold dread. This wasn't just about a missing animal, however beloved. This was about the theft of an essential piece of medical support equipment, the endangerment of an elderly disabled man, and a profound violation of federal laws Zara herself was sworn to uphold. As the plane taxied down the runway, Zara Khan, the nation's foremost expert on exotic animal enforcement, was no longer just a concerned daughter. She was an officer of the law on a mission, and Karen Bishop, whether she knew it or not, was about to discover the full formidable weight of the United States government descending upon her perfectly manicured, deceptively tranquil, suburban life. The battle for Nico had begun. The scene that greeted Zara upon her arrival at Golden Pines Estates several hours later was one of controlled but palpable tension. Local police cars were discreetly parked at either end of the quiet cul-de-sac. A uniformed officer stood at the edge of her father's property taking notes, while another was speaking with a visibly agitated Karen Bishop on her own doorstep. Arthur, frail and ashen-faced, sat in his wheelchair in the living room, attended by Maria and a palliative care nurse Zara had dispatched from a trusted local agency. The absence of Nico was a physical ache in the room, a void that amplified Arthur's vulnerability and distress. "Zara, thank God!" Arthur whispered, his voice thin and reedy, as his daughter knelt before him, taking his trembling, withered hand. His eyes, usually bright with a keen intelligence, despite his physical limitations, were clouded with fear and a profound, helpless sorrow. "She took him, Zara. I know she did. She always hated him. She called him a pest. We're going to get him back, Dad." Zara said, her voice a soothing balm of confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I promise you. We have the best people working on this." The best people included Special Agent Ben Carter, Zara's second-in-command at the National Exotic Animal Enforcement Division, who had diverted from a nearby assignment and was already on scene coordinating with local law enforcement, and a specialized primate veterinarian Zara had on emergency retainer. "Boss," Carter said, greeting Zara with a grim nod as she stepped outside to confer with him, "the situation is delicate. Bishop is denying everything, of course. Claims she hasn't seen the monkey, knows nothing about it. Says Arthur is senile and probably just let the animal escape. Her husband is a local bigwig. A property developer already called his lawyer, threatening lawsuits for harassment." "Standard playbook," Zara said, her jaw tight. "What's our leverage?" "Not much without concrete evidence placing Nico in her possession or on her property. The local PD can't get a warrant based on Arthur's suspicions alone, no matter how credible. Her lawyer is already screaming about illegal searches. We need something more." "Nico wouldn't just escape, Ben," Zara said, her voice hard. "He's bonded to my father. He's trained to stay. If he got out accidentally, his first instinct would be to find Arthur or seek help from a familiar human like Maria. He wouldn't vanish without a trace unless he was taken. And Karen Bishop had motive, opportunity, and a documented history of animosity." Zara's mind raced. Capuchin monkeys were incredibly intelligent, agile, and when distressed or improperly handled, could be surprisingly strong and capable of inflicting serious bites. If Karen had Nico, she was likely ill-equipped to care for him, and the risk of harm to Nico, or even to Karen herself if he panicked, was high. They needed to act fast, but they also needed to act smart within the bounds of the law, a law Karen Bishop was already trying to weaponize against them. The initial investigation focused on canvassing the neighborhood, searching for any witnesses who might have seen Nico or anything suspicious around Karen Bishop's property. Security camera footage from nearby homes was requested. Zara herself, drawing on her expertise in primate behavior, began to analyze the scene in her father's sunroom and patio. The open gate, the slightly ajar back door to the sunroom, Nico's abandoned puzzle toy. It all pointed to a possible luring, or a quick, opportunistic snatch, rather than a violent forced entry into the main house. Nico was small, quick, and trusting of familiar faces, even one as consistently unpleasant as Karen Bishop's, if she had offered him a treat or called to him in a non-threatening way. The first break came from an unlikely source, Mrs. Henderson, an elderly birdwatching enthusiast who lived across the street and often sat on her porch with binoculars. She tearfully recounted to Zara that she had seen Karen Bishop on her patio early that morning before Maria's arrival, making strange cooing noises towards Arthur's yard, holding something that looked like a piece of fruit. Then a small dark shape. Nico misses. Henderson was almost certain, had darted from Arthur's patio onto Karen's. A few minutes later, Mrs. Henderson had seen Karen hurry inside her own house, carrying what looked like a bundled-up towel, and she hadn't seen the little monkey since. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming Nico was just making a brief, illicit visit for a treat. But now, in light of his disappearance, it wasn't conclusive proof, but it was enough combined with Arthur's statement and Karen's known animosity for Zara to pressure local law enforcement, backed by the weight of her federal agency, to secure a limited search warrant for Karen Bishop's property, specifically for an exotic animal matching Nico's description. The warrant, however, would take hours, possibly even a day to obtain through the local court system, especially with Karen's high-powered lawyer already filing preemptive motions to block it. Time they didn't have if Nico was in distress or danger. Arthur's condition, meanwhile, was deteriorating rapidly. Without Nico, his primary means of interacting with his environment, his sense of security, and his constant companionship were gone. He refused to eat, his blood pressure was dangerously elevated, and he was sinking into a deep, despairing lethargy. The specialized support Nico provided, retrieving his medication reminder device, helping him sip water, alerting Maria to changes in his breathing patterns, was irreplaceable by human caregivers alone. Nico wasn't just an aide. He was an integral part of Arthur's medical and emotional support system. His absence was quite literally endangering Arthur's life. This Zara knew elevated Karen Bishop's actions from simple theft to potential felony elder endangerment, another charge she would ensure was added to the growing list. As day turned into a cool, anxious evening, Zara found herself pacing the confines of her father's living room, her mind a whirlwind of strategic planning and a daughter's raw fear. She was chief of exotic animal enforcement. She had coordinated raids on armed poachers in remote jungles, faced down international wildlife traffickers, rescued critically endangered animals from horrific conditions. But this case, this intensely personal battle to save one small stolen monkey and protect her beloved vulnerable father, was rapidly becoming the most challenging and emotionally wrenching of her career. Karen Bishop, with her veneer of suburban respectability and her core of cold, dismissive cruelty, was a different kind of predator, but a predator nonetheless. And Zara would not rest until Nico was safe, and Karen Bishop was facing the full, unyielding consequences of her actions. The quiet, tree-lined streets of Golden Pines Estates had become a battleground, and the fight had only just begun. The long night passed in a blur of anxious waiting and contingency planning. The search warrant for Karen Bishop's property was still tied up in legal wrangling, her attorney proving to be as tenacious and obstructive as Zara had feared. Every passing hour deepened Zara's concern for Nico's well-being. Capuchin monkeys were highly social, intelligent creatures with complex emotional and physical needs. Nico, accustomed to Arthur's constant presence, his specialized diet, his enriching environment, and his carefully managed routines, would be terrified, disoriented, and likely suffering under Karen's ignorant and probably neglectful care. Zara knew that prolonged stress, improper diet, or confinement in an unsuitable space could rapidly lead to serious health issues, even death for a primate like Nico. Arthur's condition had not improved. He remained withdrawn, barely responsive, his vital signs monitored closely by the home care nurse. His refusal to eat or drink was becoming critical. The local doctor Zara had called in expressed grave concern, suggesting that if Arthur's decline continued, hospitalization would be necessary. A traumatic upheaval Arthur in his fragile state might not withstand. The elder endangerment charge against Karen Bishop was looking less like a potentiality and more like a grim, unfolding reality. Frustrated by the legal delays, Zara focused on what she could control. She had her team from the National Exotic Animal Enforcement Division, now fully assembled in a temporary command post, set up in a nearby hotel, work on building an airtight federal case against Karen. They meticulously documented Arthur's permits for Nico's extensive training records from Helping Hands, the renowned organization that trained support primates, in the clear federal and state statutes Karen was violating by illegally possessing and concealing a specially protected support animal. They also began a deep dive into Karen Bishop's background, looking for any prior history of animal-related complaints, HOA abuses, or anything that might indicate a propensity for this kind of malicious behavior. Meanwhile, Ben Carter, Zara's deputy, worked on developing a tactical recovery plan for Nico for when, not if, they finally got the green light to enter Karen's property. Rescuing a stressed, frightened Capuchin from an unsecured environment required specialized handling techniques to ensure the safety of both the animal and the recovery team. They liaised with Dr. Emily Carter, no relation to Ben, the primate veterinarian Zara had on call, who advised on the best methods for capture sedation if necessary and immediate post-recovery care. The first significant break in the legal impasse came not from the local courts, but from a federal judge. Zara's legal team at the Department of Justice had petitioned directly citing the clear federal jurisdiction due to Nico's status as a highly regulated support animal for a disabled individual in the exigent circumstances of Arthur's declining health. The federal warrant, broader in scope and less susceptible to local political influence, was granted just before dawn on the second day of Nico's captivity. The raid on Karen Bishop's home was executed with swift, professional precision, just as the sun was beginning to cast its first pale rays over the manicured lawns of Golden Pines Estates. Zara, though officially recused from direct participation in the entry, was on scene, her heart pounding, as her team, accompanied by armed federal marshals and Dr. Carter with her primate capture and care equipment, breached the front door. Karen Bishop, roused from her sleep, was met not with the local police she had perhaps expected to further obstruct, but with a formidable federal task force. Her protests of harassment and illegal entry were curtly dismissed as she was presented with the federal warrant and detained. The search for Nico began immediately. The house, in stark contrast to its pristine exterior, was cluttered and surprisingly unkempt inside, but there was no immediate sign of the little Capuchin. Zara's fear spiked. Had Karen moved him, harmed him, sold him into the illegal exotic pet trade, a dark, lucrative underworld Zara knew all too well? Then a muffled chittering sound, weak and distressed, was heard from the basement. The door was locked. When Karen refused to provide a key, the team forced it open. The basement was dark, damp, and filled with a musty odor. And there, in a small, filthy dog crate shoved into a dark corner, was Nico. He was alive, but in a terrible state. His usually sleek, dark fur was matted and soiled. He was thin, dehydrated, and trembling violently, his bright, intelligent eyes dull with terror and despair. An empty water bowl and a few scattered pieces of dry dog kibble, a completely inappropriate and potentially harmful diet for a Capuchin, were the only provisions in his squalid prison. He cowered at the back of the crate, letting out a series of pitiful, frightened cries as the agents approached. Dr. Carter moved in slowly, speaking to Nico in soft, calming tones, offering a small piece of his favorite fruit. It took several long, tense minutes, but gradually, Nico, recognizing a kind voice and the familiar scent of his preferred food, allowed her to open the crate and gently coax him out. He was weak, disoriented, and clearly traumatized, but he was alive. Zara, watching from the doorway, felt a wave of emotions so intense, relief, rage, profound sorrow for what he had endured, that it almost buckled her knees. Nico was rushed to Dr. Carter's specialized veterinary clinic for immediate medical assessment and care. Karen Bishop, now facing a slew of additional federal charges, including cruelty to a protected animal and obstruction of a federal investigation, was transported to a federal holding facility. Her expensive lawyer's bluster had evaporated, replaced by a grim understanding of the catastrophic legal jeopardy his client was now in. The initial veterinary report on Nico was heartbreaking. He was severely malnourished, suffering from gastrointestinal distress due to the improper diet, and exhibited signs of extreme psychological trauma, including repetitive stress behaviors and a fear of enclosed spaces. It would be a long, slow road to recovery for him, both physically and emotionally. Whether he would ever be able to resume his full duties as Arthur's support monkey remained uncertain. But the most immediate concern was Arthur. When Zara gently broke the news of Nico's rescue and his condition, her father, who had been fading before her eyes, seemed to rally a flicker of his old, indomitable spirit, returning to his weary eyes. "He's alive," Arthur whispered, clutching Zara's hand. "My Nico. He's alive." "Yes, Dad," Zara said, her voice thick with emotion. "He's alive, he's safe now, and he's going to get the best care possible." The fight to bring Nico home was won, but the fight for justice, for healing, and for accountability was far from over. and as Zara looked at her father at the renewed spark of hope in his eyes, she knew that this battle, no matter how difficult, was one she was prepared to see through to the very end. Karen Bishop had underestimated not only the reach of federal law, but the fierce, unbreakable bond between a man and his support animal, and the unwavering resolve of a daughter determined to protect them both. The weeks following Nico's rescue were a delicate dance of medical care, legal maneuvering, and emotional healing. Nico remained under the intensive care of Dr. Carter and a team of primate behaviorists. His physical recovery was slow, but steady. He began to eat his specialized diet again, his weight gradually returning his matted fur after a careful, gentle grooming by Dr. Carter, starting to regain its healthy sheen. But the psychological scars were deeper. He was still fearful, easily startled, and exhibited a profound aversion to cages or any form of confinement. The bright, inquisitive spark in his eyes was often clouded by a lingering anxiety. He would only allow Dr. Carter and Zara to handle him flinching away from other unfamiliar humans. The thought of him returning to his full duties as Arthur's support monkey seemed for a time a distant, almost unattainable hope. Arthur, however, buoyed by the news of Nico's safety, began to show remarkable improvement. His appetite returned, his vital signs stabilized, and the deep depression that had enveloped him began to lift. He spoke of Nico constantly, his primary concern, not for his own needs, but for Nico's well-being. "He's a sensitive soul, Zara." Arthur would say, his voice still weak, but gaining strength. "That woman, what she did to him, it's unforgivable." Zara, meanwhile, was relentless in her pursuit of justice against Karen Bishop. The federal case was strong, the evidence irrefutable, but Karen's high-powered defense attorney was proving to be a formidable adversary, employing every legal tactic imaginable to delay proceedings, discredit witnesses, and paint Karen as a misguided, mentally unstable individual rather than a malicious criminal. He filed motions to suppress evidence, claimed Karen was incompetent to stand trial, and even tried to argue that Nico as a primate did not qualify for the same legal protections as a traditional service animal like a dog. Zara and her team at the Department of Veteran Justice, along with the U.S. Attorney's Office, systematically dismantled each of these arguments. They presented expert testimony from leading primatologists and service animal trainers, affirming Nico's legal status, his specialized training, and the profound medically recognized benefits he provided to Arthur. They introduced Karen's own HOA records, which detailed her long-standing targeted complaints against Nico, establishing a clear pattern of animus. And they prepared Arthur, with the help of victim advocates, to give a deposition, his quiet dignity and unwavering love for Nico, a powerful counterpoint to Karen's claims of his senility. The HOA at Golden Pines Estates, meanwhile, was in utter turmoil. With Karen Bishop's arrest and the revelations of her cruelty, her reign of terror had ended, but the community was left fractured and deeply ashamed. The remaining board members facing a barrage of criticism and potential legal action from residents for their negligence and complicity resigned en masse. An emergency town hall meeting was called a chaotic emotional affair, where residents vented their anger, their fear, and their collective guilt for having allowed Karen's behavior to go unchecked for so long. Many residents, including Mrs. Henderson, who had witnessed Karen luring Nico, came forward with their own stories of Karen's bullying, her abuse of power, and her discriminatory actions against other vulnerable members of the community. It was during this period of community upheaval that the Midpoint Twist in Karen Bishop's case began to emerge, a discovery that would catapult her crimes from malicious animal cruelty and elder endangerment into an entirely different realm of federal illegality. While investigating Karen's finances to build a case for restitution and to counter her claims of diminished mental capacity, her spending habits were in fact lavish and meticulously managed. FBI financial analysts working with Zara's team stumbled upon a series of suspicious offshore accounts and coded transactions. These transactions linked Karen Bishop not just to her husband's somewhat murky property development deals, but to a shadowy international network involved in the illegal trafficking of exotic animals, including primates. It appeared that Karen Bishop's obsession with Nico, her desire to possess him, might not have been solely about her prejudice or her desire to control her neighborhood. Nico, as a healthy, well-trained Capuchin, was a valuable commodity in the illegal exotic pet trade, a market Zara knew was fueled by vanity, ignorance, and immense profits, and which often resulted in horrific suffering for the animals involved. Had Karen intended to sell Nico? Was her public persona as a prim and proper HOA president a cover for a more sinister involvement in this cruel and illegal trade? The pieces began to fall into place. Her unusual knowledge of primate behavior, however twisted her access to resources, her apparent lack of fear of repercussions. This discovery electrified the investigation. Zara's Exotic Animal Enforcement Division, which specialized in dismantling precisely these kinds of trafficking rings, took the lead. They began to unravel a complex web of contacts, couriers, and clandestine holding facilities. Karen Bishop, it turned out, was not a major player, but a mid-level facilitator using her respectable suburban facade and her HOA connections to source and temporarily house exotic animals for onward sale, often to wealthy, unscrupulous collectors. Her home, the one searched for Nico, had apparently been cleaned of any other exotic animals shortly before the raid, suggesting she had been tipped off or had become increasingly paranoid. But the financial trail, the digital communications were undeniable. Her kidnapping of Nico now took on an even more chilling dimension. It wasn't just a crime of opportunity or hate, it was potentially an attempt to procure a valuable asset, or perhaps to silence Arthur if he or Nico had inadvertently witnessed something related to her trafficking activities. The cruelty inflicted on Nico in the basement might have been a panicked, amateurish attempt to break him or keep him hidden when her initial plans went awry due to Zara's swift intervention. The charges against Karen Bishop escalated dramatically. She was now facing a federal RICO indictment for her involvement in a criminal conspiracy to traffic endangered and protected species on top of the existing charges. Her high-powered attorney for the first time looked genuinely rattled. The prospect of his client facing decades in a federal supermax prison alongside hardened international criminals was a far cry from the misguided animal lover narrative he had been trying to spin. The upcoming HOA meeting, which had been rescheduled by the newly appointed interim board, a group of genuinely concerned and reform-minded residents, was no longer just about community healing or addressing Karen's past abuses. It was now set against the backdrop of a massive federal criminal investigation that reached far beyond the manicured lawns of Golden Pines Estates. Zara, invited by the interim board to address the community, knew she had a responsibility not only to update them on the case against Karen as it pertained to Nico and her father, but also to warn them about the insidious reach of the illegal wildlife trade, a trade that had shockingly found a foothold in their seemingly peaceful suburb. The fight for Nico had become a fight against a global criminal enterprise, and Karen Bishop was about to become its very public, very disgraced local face. The emergency HOA meeting at Golden Pines Estates was unlike any the community had ever experienced. The usual bickering over lawn ornaments and paint colors was replaced by a somber, almost funereal atmosphere, punctuated by hushed whispers and anxious glances. The clubhouse was packed not just with residents, but with local media animal welfare advocates and a palpable sense of a community grappling with a profound betrayal. Karen Bishop was absent, confined to a federal detention center, her bail having been revoked in light of the new, far more serious charges related to exotic animal trafficking. Her empty chair at the front of the room, where the HOA president usually presided, was a stark symbol of her downfall. The interim HOA president, a retired schoolteacher named Eleanor Vance, opened the meeting with a heartfelt apology to Arthur Miller, to Zara Khan, and to the entire community for the shame and harm Karen Bishop's actions had brought upon Golden Pines. She pledged a new era of transparency, accountability, and compassion. Then Zara Khan was invited to speak. She stood before her neighbors, not just as Arthur Miller's daughter, but as Special Agent Zara Khan, Chief of National Exotic Animal Enforcement, a leading expert in a dark and dangerous world most of them could barely imagine. Her voice was calm, but her words carried the weight of undeniable authority and a deep personal conviction. She began by updating them on Nico's condition, his slow but steady recovery, the dedication of his veterinary team, and the hope that he might one day resume his role as Arthur's support companion. She spoke of her father's resilience, his quiet courage in the face of such a traumatic ordeal. She thanked the community for the outpouring of support they had received. Then her tone shifted. She detailed the full scope of Karen Bishop's crimes, not just the theft and abuse of Nico, not just the elder endangerment, but her insidious involvement in the illegal trafficking of exotic animals. She explained how Karen had used her position, her home, and her respectable facade to facilitate a cruel and criminal trade that caused immense suffering to countless animals and posed a significant threat to global biodiversity and public safety. She showed anonymized slides of the types of animals Karen had been involved with, endangered primates, rare birds, exotic reptiles, and described the brutal conditions in which they were often captured, transported, and kept. Karen Bishop was not just a misguided neighbor or a power-hungry HOA president. Zara stated, her voice ringing with a cold anger. She was a criminal, a willing participant in a global network that profits from cruelty and exploitation. Your community, Golden Pines Estates, was unbeknownst to you a transit point, a holding facility in this chain of suffering. The evil we confronted here was not just local. It was a tendril of a much larger, much darker entity. A wave of shock and revulsion swept through the room. Residents who had known Karen for years, who had served on committees with her, who had exchanged pleasantries over garden fences, struggled to reconcile the image of their prim, controlling HOA president with the reality of a federal criminal involved in such a sordid enterprise. Many expressed shame, guilt, and a profound sense of having been duped. Zara then outlined the steps her agency, in coordination with international law enforcement partners, was taking to dismantle the trafficking network Karen Bishop was part of. She spoke of arrests being made of animals being rescued, of a renewed commitment to combating this insidious crime. This will not be an easy process for Golden Pines, Zara concluded. There will be ongoing investigations, there will be difficult questions to answer, there will be a need for profound community healing and reform. But I believe this community has the strength, the resilience, and now the awareness to emerge from this stronger, more vigilant, and more compassionate. What happened to my father and to Nico was a tragedy. But if it serves as a catalyst for positive change, if it helps to shine a light on the darkness that can hide in even the most tranquil of places, then their suffering will not have been in vain. In the weeks and months that followed, Golden Pines Estates began that long, arduous process of rebuilding. The HOA was completely restructured. New leadership under Eleanor Vance implemented stringent ethical guidelines, full financial transparency, and a zero-tolerance policy for any form of discrimination or abuse. They established a community watch program specifically focused on animal welfare and identifying suspicious activities. They partnered with Zara's agency and local animal shelters to host educational workshops on responsible pet ownership, the dangers of the exotic pet trade, and the importance of protecting vulnerable animals and community members. Karen Bishop's legal fate was sealed. Faced with an ironclad federal RICO indictment and the prospect of spending the rest of her life in prison, she accepted a plea bargain that saw her convicted on multiple felony counts of animal trafficking, conspiracy, animal cruelty, and elder endangerment. She was sentenced to 20 years in a federal correctional facility, stripped of all her assets, and would forever be a pariah, her name synonymous with betrayal and cruelty. The trafficking network she was part of was largely dismantled thanks to the evidence and intelligence gathered during the investigation that had started with one stolen support monkey. Nicos Recovery continued. It was a slow, challenging journey, but with the unwavering dedication of Dr. Carter, the primate behaviorists, and most importantly, Arthur's constant loving presence, their visits, initially brief and supervised, gradually became longer and more joyful. Nico began to rediscover his trust, his confidence, and his playful spirit. The day he spontaneously leaped onto Arthur's lap, chittering happily, and grooming his beard, was a day of tears and celebration for everyone involved. He would always bear the scars of his ordeal, a slight tremor in his left hand, a wariness of strangers, but he was unmistakably Nico again. He eventually resumed his duties as Arthur's support companion, their bond deeper and more precious than ever. Arthur Miller, with Nico back by his side, experienced a remarkable resurgence of health and vitality. His spirit, so nearly broken, mended along with his beloved companions. He became an outspoken advocate for the rights of disabled individuals and the importance of legitimate service and support animals, sharing his story at community events and inspiring many with his quiet courage and resilience. Zara Khan continued her vital work, leading the fight against exotic animal trafficking with renewed vigor and a profound personal understanding of the stakes. The Golden Pines Estates case became a landmark, a testament to the dedication of her team, and a stark warning to those who would exploit or harm vulnerable animals and people. Life in Golden Pines Estates found a new equilibrium, one built not on superficial aesthetics or arbitrary rules, but on genuine community compassion and a shared commitment to vigilance. The memory of Karen Bishop's reign of terror served as a constant reminder of the darkness they had faced, but also of the strength they had found in overcoming it. And sometimes on a quiet afternoon, residents would see Arthur Miller out on his patio, the sun warm on his face. His small, indomitable Capuchin companion perched contentedly on his shoulder, a living symbol of hope, healing, and the enduring power of the bond between humans and animals to triumph over even the most profound cruelty. The silence that had once filled Arthur's home with dread was now replaced by the happy, familiar chitters of a beloved friend, a sound that resonated with the hard-won peace of their new beginning. Nguon,